Happy Monday, everyone. We're on chapter 8 of our book, I Survived the American Revolution, 1776. We're going to pick up where we left off. Nate took off, joining the stampede of terrified soldiers rushing away from the docks. He ended up alone in an alley, huddling in the doorway of a stone building. He knew trying to hide was useless. No building would protect him from the force of a cannonball. But he couldn't just stand out in the street. He squeezed himself tighter into the doorway and tried not to think about the gruesome stories Papa's men used to tell, about men who'd had their heads blown off by cannonballs. What a fool Nate was. He'd never make it out here on his own. He wasn't tough like Slash O'Shea. When Slash was just 14, the merchant ship he worked on was destroyed in a storm. Only a few men survived, including Slash. And what did he do next? He joined the British Army. England was in the middle of a huge war with France and Spain. Slash was stationed on a man-of-war on the cannon deck. He was a powder monkey, which meant it was his job to rush heavy bags of explosive gunpowder to the men loading the cannons. Powder monkeys had to be small and fast like real monkeys, and as brave as lions. Because cannons didn't just kill the enemy. Sudden sparks, too much gunpowder, any small mistake could cause an accidental explosion. It was one of those fiery accidents that left Slash without his right hand. After that, the Navy didn't want him anymore. But Slash didn't curl up like a little shrimp. No, he went on to be the greatest pirate ever. Thinking about Slash calmed Nate down a bit and put that strong, shimmering feeling inside his chest again. Nate closed his eyes and pictured Papa's face. He tried to imagine Eliza's hand gripping his. When Nate finally opened his eyes, the explosions had faded. The smoke had mostly cleared. Those British warships must have sailed away. Nate unpeeled himself from the stone wall. Now he just wanted to get out of this battlefield, and if he couldn't escape on a boat, he'd just have to walk. The whiff of gunpowder still prickled Nate's nose, but the danger seemed to have passed. The soldiers on the streets were back to work with their shovels and axes. Nate walked north, hoping to find the road out of the city. He passed a big lawn that had been turned into a huge army camp. Every inch of grass was covered with tents. Row after crooked row of the grimiest, droopiest tents Nate had ever seen. Nate wove through a crowd of soldiers, building an enormous wall out of dirt and rocks. A man's voice shouted out from somewhere behind him. "Nate!" Nate ignored it. There had to be dozens of Nathaniels in this city. But then the voice shouted again, "Nathaniel Fox!" Nate's heart stopped. His mind spun until he understood who it had to be. One of Storch's men. You can see here there's a picture showing the tents. And then this must be Nate here and all the soldiers in the background. His wretched uncle had a whole crew of muscled bullies he hired to collect money from people who owed him. And now one of those men had tracked Nate down. He was going to drag him back to Storch for more beatings. Nate took off in a panic. He sprinted across the street. He had just made it when a strong hand grabbed hold of the back of his shirt. Nate wriggled and squirmed until he wrenched himself free. He whirled around and raised his fists, ready to fight. He lifted his chin and stared dead on into the face of the man chasing him. And then Nate's mouth fell open in shock. It was a young soldier with a goofy gap-toothed smile. A mop of bright red curls spilled out from under a crumpled green triangle hat. Before Nate could say anything, the man grabbed Nate into a crushing, joyful hug. It was his old friend from Papa's crew, Paul Dobbins. Chapter 9. Paul let go of Nate and stepped back. His smile had fallen away. Now his expression was almost angry, like Nate had hurt him somehow. "I sent you at least 10 letters, Paul said. "I rode in a wagon for 2 days to get to your uncle's house. And when I got there, he told me you wouldn't see me. He slammed the door right in my face." Storch was a lying, evil rat. He'd made Nate believe that his only old friend in the world had forgotten about him. Tears burned Nate's eyes. I didn't know, he said, barely choking out the words. Paul looked surprised at first, but his eyes drifted down to Nate's neck, which still hurt from Storch's strangling attack. Paul's face turned white. "Where did you get those bruises?" he said softly. "Did he?" Nate hadn't seen himself in a mirror, but from Paul's horrified expression, Nate realized he must look worse than he imagined. Those angry bruises told Paul everything he needed to know about life with Storch. "Good Lord, Nate," Paul whispered. "If I had known." Nate looked away so Paul wouldn't see his tears, but Paul was crying too. And anyway, Nate wasn't crying about Storch. He wouldn't waste a tear on that snake-hearted beast. Nate was crying because he'd let himself lose faith in Paul. Neither cried for long. Paul put his hands on Nate's shoulders. He leaned close. "Well," he said, "we found each other, didn't we?" They sat down in a shady spot near the tents. Paul peeled off his ugly green hat and placed it carefully on the ground. "My lucky charm," he said. Nate tried not to stare at Paul, but he kept thinking of the devilish teenager who clowned around on Papa's ships. He'd sneak vinegar into the men's canteens. He'd taught the ship's parrot to cuss in French. Nobody drove Papa and his men crazier or made them laugh harder. But now Paul's eyes looked serious and thoughtful. He listened closely as Nate told him about Storch and how Eliza and Theo had become like family to him. He explained how he'd fled from Storch and had hoped to find a job on a ship. Paul shook his head. "Hardly any ships coming or going from New York City these days. The British attack is coming any day." British warships had been streaming into the harbor all month, Paul said. Each one was packed tight with redcoats. There were hundreds of ships here already, and tens of thousands of soldiers. The ships were anchored about 8 miles from here, off Staten Island. Those 2 warships today gave us just a little hint of what's to come, Paul said. They just wanted to give us a little scare and catch us by surprise. Next time, we'll be ready. Paul told Nate that he'd been in the Army for more than 18 months and stationed here in New York City since May. Before that, he'd been living on his family's farm in northern Connecticut. "I figured you'd gone back to sea," Nate said. Paul shook his head, and a shadow passed across Paul's face. "I couldn't even look at the ocean. Not after," Nate finished the sentence in his mind, "after we lost Papa." He and Nate were quiet for a moment, and then Paul went on. He told Nate about his life on the farm, how he'd loved being with his parents, but had nearly gone crazy with boredom. "The chickens never laughed at my jokes," he said. Paul wanted an adventure. He thought about heading out west to the wilds of Ohio, but then in April of 1775, everything changed. That was when the first battle broke out between British and American troops in and around the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. Within a week, Paul had joined the fight. "I had no idea what it meant to be a soldier," Paul said. "The first time I fired a musket, I almost blew my hand off." He held out his thumb. It looked like the tip had been gnawed off by a barracuda. Paul chuckled. "But I had to learn pretty quick." Paul got serious again. "That's because just about 7 weeks later, he found himself in the bloody battle of Bunker Hill. I almost didn't make it out of that one alive," he said quietly. And then Paul told Nate the story of how he almost died on a hill outside of Boston. All right, that's 2 chapters. So, Paul comes back. Was anybody expecting that? We'll discuss it on Wednesday in our class meeting, okay? Have a great afternoon.